Good morning, everybody. Thank you guys so much for joining us today. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on what part of the world you're in. Welcome to our webinar. My name is Jamie Fortin. I work for the Responsible Sourcing Network on our cotton program, and I'll be leading our webinar today. It'll focus on Uyghur forced labor, the call to action sponsored by the End Uyghur Forced Labor Coalition, and the YESS initiative, Yarn Ethically and Sustainably Sourced. Thank you guys again for joining us. I'm going to start with a few logistics about how the webinar will work. So just so everybody is aware, the webinar will be recorded today. The recording will be available after the webinar occurs. There's a Q&A window. It says questions on the right side of your screen. So throughout the webinar, if you have any questions that you would like to raise, go ahead and type them in to the little question bar on the right. And at the very end, we will have all of the speakers answer questions with what time we have. If your question isn't answered, we will be taking all of the questions today and putting them in an FAQ on our website. We will email that out as well. So make sure you keep an eye on that. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can. Today, though, you will receive an email link with the recording and the slides as well. Next slide. So like I said, my name is Jamie. Our speakers today will be Louisa Griva. She is the Director of Global Advocacy at the Uyghur Human Rights Project. We'll also hear from Patricia Jurewicz. She is the founder and vice president of the Responsible Sourcing Network. And finally, Liz Muller, who is the founder of Liz Muller and Partners, will be speaking. So next I'll discuss our agenda for the day. So we'll start with Louisa Griva. She'll be talking about an update on the human rights abuses occurring in the Uyghur region. And then Patricia will go on to discuss the call to action, brand engagement, and regulation. And finally, Liz will be discussing the Yarn Ethically and Sustainably Sourced, or YESS initiative, as it relates to the Uyghur forced labor issue. And then at the very end, like I said, we'll go into our Q&A. So I won't go into detailed backgrounds on our speakers yet, but we will have a link to their bios once we send out the webinar information, so make sure you keep an eye on that. We will also have the information to contact all of our speakers as well at the end if you would like to follow up with anybody. So Louisa Griva will get us started.
Good morning, everyone. I'm showing you some of the faces of the disappeared in the Uyghur homeland. It is, as you know, the Xinjiang region, actually not a province, but a region with autonomous rights. The Uyghurs don't like this term because it means new frontier. They prefer if we say the Uyghur region. My organization, the Uyghur Human Rights Project, has been documenting forced labor since 2008. There is now, however, since 2016, an wholesale onslaught on the culture, civilization, religion, language, and the very bodies of the Uyghurs. Religion is replaced by worship of the Communist Party. Police stations are everywhere in an extreme securitization, not only of street level control, but of surveillance. And here's a traditional street, just a few people on it, and look at the number of surveillance cameras. This is combined with high-tech software for a kind of nightmarish Orwellian control using voice pattern analyzers, location trackers, smartphone scanners, ID scanners. And this is a leaked Chinese government document from a single county in the southern part of the Uyghur region, recording individuals and entire families, recording, as you can see, their phone numbers, their details, how they're related, what day they were taken into detention. And this final column on the right is their reason for detention for all kinds of so-called offenses such as praying daily. And here's what happens to the people under such surveillance. Wholesale roundup. At one point, the Chinese government was posting these photos. Local government officials were showing how they had opened detention centers to control the Uyghurs. This was again on a social media account of a local government official. And we have other documentation that includes the famous satellite photo showing a building on the left, which is at the top of the photo on the right, and behind it, a vast complex of yet more detention buildings. This is a gigantic project of control and mass detention, complete with guard towers showing that this is not just an ordinary building or dormitory. It was quite clear in the international press as of 2 years ago, August 2018, that it was a massive program. Nobody was using the word genocide, but now people know it is a program of genocidal repression. And the government of China has steadfastly tried to say, actually, first they said there is no such thing as re-education centers in August, again, exactly 2 years ago. Then quickly in October, the government admitted that there are re-education centers, but said they're for vocational training, which immediately brings up the issue of manufacturing. And here again, the Global Times government-owned newspaper is saying, here we are, making shoes and vocational training. The slogans say, freedom, peace, and the public good. The government tried to show the international media that everyone was happy in these training centers. This woman here is admitting that she committed thought crimes when so-called extremist thoughts appeared in her head. She'd been forced to memorize this and says so on camera in Chinese. This is the English voiceover I'm giving you from January last year. But it was quite clear even before that, in December 2018, that there was an issue with the supply chains. This is Badger Software, a famous case I'm sure you're all familiar with, again, nearly 2 years ago. The press, of course, were covering this quite extensively. You recall Australian media covered cotton a year and a half ago. Hearings in the United States, the biggest one was in last October, after the Australian reporting came out. Forced labor, mass internment, and social control in Xinjiang. The Apparel and Footwear Association was already issuing statements about the need to closely scrutinize labor practices in Xinjiang. Of course, they call it a province, which it's not. The US government as well, Congress already wrote, again, this is last year, writing to the Customs and Border Protection on the need to enforce US laws prohibiting the import of goods made in whole or in part with prison labor or forced labor. Yet we still had headlines in the press talking about Xinjiang cotton sparking concern. And my reason for including this slide is to point out that this is long after concern had already been sparked. But I guess some parts of the media are still waking up. We did have a formal statement from the Fair Labor Association in January this year, followed by additional statements later on. And the big blockbuster report is this Uyghurs for Sale report from the Australian Strategic and Policy Institute, backed up by the Washington Post on the ground confirmation of forced labor in the Nike factory, or let's say the Qingdao Taekwang factory that was producing for Nike. Then right after that, in March 11th, again, congressional report and hearing on global supply chains and forced labor, followed this July by the Xinjiang Supply Chain Business Advisory issued by 4 cabinet departments. And the ethical investor community, of course, has been highly focused on this, and this investor guidance is quite detailed, coming out last month from the Investor Alliance for Human Rights. In July, the Coalition to End Uyghur Forced Labor was launched. These are the statistics that are now everywhere. We all know how much of Chinese cotton is produced in the Uyghur region, how much of the world's cotton comes from the Uyghur region, and therefore, by implication, the potential tainting of a huge proportion of the garment supply in the entire world. And the headlines keep coming. This is what is concerning all ethical supply chain watchdogs, companies, and governments alike. Some details about the coalition that launched the call to action to end Uyghur forced labor. It is a large coalition. Over 250 groups around the world have endorsed it from 35 countries. 51 of those endorsers are active members of the coalition. The steering committee consists of 12 members. My organization, the Uyghur Human Rights Project, is one of 4 Uyghur organizations that are active in the steering committee. The goal is to end state-sponsored forced labor and other egregious human rights abuses affecting the Uyghurs, Kazakhs, and other Turkic peoples. The strategy starts with the brand engagement call to action, particularly in the garment sector. Although this is not the end of the story, there will be other actions. There is an appeal to regulatory action in the US. The US government has the strongest laws in the world prohibiting import of forced labor goods. Yet there is concern, of course, in Europe and other countries, and then multilateral organizations have standards that need to be activated, the ILO, the OECD. I'm showing you some of these are the logos of the leaders of the coalition, including the trade unions, the ethical investors, the worker rights organizations, and the Uyghur diaspora organizations desperately calling for the world's attention to this horrific crisis under the government of China. At this point, I will turn over the microphone to Patricia Jurwitz. And we will get Patricia Jurwitz's microphone on very soon. If Patricia, you're able to go back to that first slide with your microphone on, that would be quite helpful. Thank you.
Okay, now can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Yes,
okay,
we can.
Great.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you. I was saying that the situation really deserves a lot more time, but thank you, Louisa, for going over it fairly quickly. As I'm sure many people on the webinar understand and have seen over the years, because as Louisa pointed out, the information has been coming out about this situation for several years now. It warrants great attention from all of us. And as a result, as Louisa mentioned, the coalition has come together to end forced labor of Uyghur people and other Muslim minorities. And the call to action really speaks to what the coalition feels is needed to remove that risk out of the supply chains of the apparel and fashion industries, as well as other products. But the coalition in particular is focused on textiles and apparel. And there's 3 main components to the call to action. It's engaging with the coalition, identifying and mapping the business relationships with suppliers either in the Uyghur region or using Uyghur workers, and then to take action to prevent the use of Uyghur forced labor. So the first component is to provide a timeline within a year of achieving the commitment that is outlined in the call to action, providing regular reporting to the coalition and agreeing to appropriate remedial action. And there's flexibility there on what needs to happen to ensure that the workers that have been identified, mainly those workers that have been moved to suppliers outside of the Uyghur region, returning them to their homes, making sure they're compensated appropriately. And the really important aspect is that the coalition is looking to have a publicly available list of the signatories to the call to action. And that is going to be determined together with the signatories. Right now, what the coalition's looking at is that either a minimum number of signatories of brands and retailers have signed the call to action, or it would also look at the size of the companies that have signed. But the important thing is that it would be together decided upon at what point will that list be made public. We know that it's a very sensitive topic for a lot of companies to be public about their actions. We know that many companies are actually taking action behind the scenes. With that said, given that over 250 organizations have endorsed the call to action, it's important for the public to know which brands and retailers are taking action and which ones are not. So the second component is really mapping and following those, looking at those business relationships. We know that it's easy for brands to identify or to disengage from their tier one suppliers, from those that are producing the finished goods and ensuring that those suppliers are not located in the Uyghur region. But it's also then looking at either suppliers or sub-suppliers that the parent organization, the parent company may have subsidiaries in the Uyghur region, or that they've received some sort of compensation, or that the Chinese government has actually sent workers to their facilities. Part C of mapping is looking at suppliers or sub-suppliers that are located in other parts of China, but that they have received workers from the Uyghur region. And lastly, looking at business relationships, whether that supplier is located in China or globally, that is receiving inputs from the Uyghur region, such as fabric, yarn, cotton. We've also heard recently of viscose being another material that's being produced in the Uyghur region. The third component, once those business relationships have been identified, is to actively disengage or end the business relationship, or make sure that the brand or retailer is not purchasing or sourcing any either inputs or finished product from those that I just outlined in the second component. So making sure that the brand is not sourcing directly from finished goods manufacturers in the Uyghur region, disengaging from those relationships with that have subsidiaries or operations in the Uyghur region, disengaging from business relationships that have received Uyghur workers, even if that's outside of the Uyghur region, located somewhere else in China, and to instruct your suppliers to end all sourcing of any finished products or inputs coming from the Uyghur region, and assisting those suppliers to identify alternative sources if needed. Lastly, it's really communicating to those suppliers that they should not be sourcing any inputs, cotton, yarn, or textiles from the Uyghur region, whether it's for the brand's products or not. But they should not be sourcing anything from that area. The type of engagement that the coalition is doing right now, the original call to action asks for companies to respond by the 20th of August. I know that there's a number of engagements and conversations that are currently ongoing, especially given a lot of holiday happening in August. Coalition members are reaching out to brands to follow up on the call to action. Brands are also encouraged to reach out to the coalition themselves. We have the email address there. And overall, the endorsers of the call to action, the over 250 NGOs that I mentioned, and they're located on the coalition website, they're going to be watching to see what brands are taking action, what comments they have on their own websites or in their own sustainability reports, or also in their reporting to the UK government in their Modern Slavery Act comments. And those endorsers are going to be reaching out also to brands independently, asking them to take more action or to ask them to sign the call to action. And so those organizations will take appropriate action. That's not being coordinated overall by the coalition. Individual organizations are going to do what they feel is appropriate. I did, even though Louisa went over a number of the regulations, I just have a list here. We will be making the slides public, and these are all hyperlinked. Louisa mentioned the U.S. Business Advisory, which we know something like that has not happened in quite a long time. The entity list has been issued by the Department of Commerce, the Bureau of Industry and Security. Many of you may be well aware that the Xinjiang Uyghur Textile Group is listed, and the list of companies, 11, were just recently communicated. They're companies implicated in human rights violations and abuses. The U.S. sanctions, we've seen a number of comments or even subsidiaries linked to the XPCC. The U.S. sanction is stating that companies cannot be sourcing or purchasing any product linked to XPCC. I do include here a link to the history of the XPCC's involvement in cotton production in the Uyghur region. As Louisa had up there, the estimation is about 84% of China's cotton comes from that region. China and India are the two largest producers of cotton in the world, so it's estimated that about 20% of cotton in the world is coming from the Uyghur region. And the XPCC has played an enormous role in harvesting that cotton. As many of you may have seen also, very recently, there has been a petition sent to CBP, the Customs and Border Protection Agency, requesting that cotton products be added to the withhold release order list. Our friends over at the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility, along with AFL-CIO and a number of human rights organizations, all signed that petition asking for cotton and cotton products from the Uyghur region to be added to the WRO list. I want to really point out this inability to conduct audits and conduct due diligence. CBP's advice on mitigating forced labor, and it talks about the importance for companies to map their supply chain, which is what the coalition is asking for, and then to conduct due diligence. But it's really an inability to be conducting due diligence at this time. Scott Nova and Adrian Zenz put out a letter to auditors, which this links to, pointing out the inability to conduct audits or due diligence, or what you could do to actually know or not know if any forced labor is being used. We know that a lot of audits are not getting the whole picture. If there's surveillance cameras all over and people are not comfortable telling the truth of what's happening, it's impossible to really know what's happening and what level of abuse exists. And, you know, I think BCI came to that same understanding in knowing and realizing that its own assurance process could not be implemented in a credible manner, and therefore suspended all of its licensing in the Uyghur region. So with that, I'll go ahead and hand it over to my dear friend and colleague, Liz Muller, who will be able to go into detail on how the YESS initiative works and how what to do in the case of the inability of conducting due diligence in the Uyghur region. Liz?
Thank you, Patricia. So I have had the, oh, excuse me. I'm not sure if my controls are working. Pardon me for one moment.
They are. They're working.
I'm not seeming to have control.
Okay.
While I sort this out, I would like to just, okay, sorry. These are not seeming to work on my keyboard. I'm jumping ahead here. So I would love to, if Allison might be able to help me get back to the beginning. It doesn't seem to be working on my end. So maybe if you could switch the slides for me, that would be fantastic. So sorry about that. I've had the pleasure to partner with Patricia and the Responsible Sourcing Network in 2017 and 2018 to conduct the research for and write the YESS standard. The YESS standard, Yarn Ethically and Sustainably Sourced, aims to create an industry-wide approach to encourage yarn spinning mills and textile mills to implement risk-based due diligence management systems to avoid sourcing cotton produced with forced labor. The existing YESS cotton standard was developed with a specific practical framework to assess the operations, management systems, and practices of cotton yarn spinning mills. More precisely, it is a guide for a spinner to avoid sourcing cotton inputs that have a high likelihood of forced labor risks in production. We aim to develop a similar standard for application at the textile mills. The YESS standard is intended to align with the OECD due diligence guidance for responsible supply chains in the garment and footwear sector. The guidance specifies that all enterprises, regardless of size, have the responsibility to carry out due diligence in order to avoid and address the potential negative impacts of their activities and supply chains. The OECD guidance lays out these 6 steps that enterprises should implement: to embed responsible business conduct in policy and management systems, to identify potential and actual harm in supply chains, cease, prevent, or mitigate harm found in supply chains, and then to track performance, communicate activities and progress, and provide for or cooperate in remediation when appropriate. Given today's limited time, I'm going to focus on the first 3 steps. Next slide, please. Commodity supply chains are complex and dynamic. Even for one material, such as cotton as depicted here, you can see why I refer to commodity supply chains as supply webs. There are multiple tiers along a supply chain, and within each tier, there could be numerous, or in the case of small-scale farmers, virtually uncountable quantities of actors in vastly different contexts around the globe. It is very challenging and can be daunting when enterprises want to influence change at each stage and in each geographic region, especially at the farm level. Since no enterprise can address all of the impacts associated with all of the products they sell, it is important for organizations to prioritize actions by taking a risk-based approach. Next slide, please. In this slide, I provide a simplified depiction of the supply chain, highlighting three basic segments. The upstream, where actors produce the raw material, such as cotton farmers, and initial processing to concentrate the desired content in region, such as removing the seeds from the cotton lint at a ginner. On the other end, we have downstream, where actors use processed material in the manufacturing of final products. For example, garment manufacturers, brands, or retailers. In the context of due diligence, these companies can work with one another to identify actors along this portion of the supply chain. YESS focuses on the middle segment of the supply chain, where spinning mills and textiles mills mix and transform raw material into a product, such as cotton lint into yarn at the spinning mills, or yarn into fabric at the textile mill. The yarn spinner is where the traceability of the raw material to the country of origin or farm is often lost. This is often referred to as the choke point in the supply chain, since participation of spinning mills is critical to identifying the country, and in most cases, gin, where the cotton was produced. Responsible Sourcing Network created the YESS standard for spinning mills first. Textile mills blend different yarns, including cotton and other natural fibers or synthetic filaments, to create fabric per the customer specification. Textile mills will have knowledge of what cotton yarn spinners supplied the yarn, but would require the cooperation of its supplying spinners to identify the source of the cotton lint at the country or gin level, or even farm in some cases. YESS recognizes the fact that few brands can identify spinning mills in their supply chain, and very few, if any, have relationships with those spinning mills. With these two considerations in mind, Responsible Sourcing Network aims to develop a YESS standard for textile mills to encourage them to conduct due diligence of their suppliers and the cotton inputs. As previously mentioned, per the call to action, as well as current and potential regulations, brands need to avoid sourcing either cotton or yarn produced in the Uyghur region, making the case for developing a YESS standard for textile mills even stronger. Next slide. So getting back to the YESS standard, which again follows OECD guidance, begins with a strong policy, which is essential to an effective management system. Policy must have the intent, implementation, and impact, meaning it must state and have a commitment to sourcing cotton that does not involve forced labor, and that policy must be communicated to suppliers. It needs to be supported through the implementation of procedures, as well as ensuring that employees are trained on those procedures. And then it must work as intended with the desired outcomes achieved. Next slide. So as Patricia mentioned, it is very important to map your supply chain. And as most of you will know, mapping your supply chain is the first step to identifying what supply chain actors and materials are used in making your products, the what materials, where materials are produced, and who processes them. This is not an easy exercise for one product line, not to mention the myriad of products one brand can have, if you remember that supply web slide. Under the call to action and US sanctions, brands will need to identify if cotton lint or yarn was produced in the Uyghur region, or if spinning mill is an XBCC-run company. With this focus and trade flow information, there are ways to take a risk-based approach to focus on spinners or textile mills that may be more likely linked to the Uyghur region of concern. Conducting a YESS assessment of textile mills to identify XBCC spinning mills or spinning mills in the Uyghur region should help brands refine the number of spinning mills that would then need to be assessed under YESS. Next slide, please. Another critical aspect of the YESS standard is to identifying risks of harm. There are several types of harm that are laid out in OECD's guidance, from human rights to the environment. The YESS standard focuses solely on forced labor at the cotton farm. And using credible sources, Responsible Sourcing Network has identified 9 countries that pose a high risk of forced labor in cotton production. But for the purposes of today's presentation, we will focus on cotton produced or spun into yarn in the Uyghur region. It should be noted that OECD and YESS promotes a risk-based approach that allows enterprises to focus their resources and efforts where risks of harm are most severe and significant. The Uyghur situation certainly fits the bill, unfortunately. Next slide. So due diligence focuses on 2 things primarily: the material and the suppliers. The material risks are often linked to the geographic origin and include manipulation of labels to indicate erroneous countries of origin. And supplier risks center on legality and trustworthiness of those suppliers and transparency. So we'll start with the next slide, speaking of supplier due diligence. According to OECD and YESS, enterprises are expected to understand the identity and type of business their suppliers are engaged in, so that they can identify and manage any risks associated with their suppliers. A Know Your Supplier, or KYS, process should be implemented and at a minimum include criteria to establish the identity of the supplier, ensure the legality of their business, and outline the type of business relationships between the enterprise and their supplier. Additional due diligence of suppliers associated with risks of harm could include further surveys or on-site visits to check that they have due diligence systems in place. An enterprise should next communicate their responsible business conduct policy to the supplier and require evidence to validate the conformance with that policy. This would include, but not limited to, providing required documents to validate the origin of each transaction. Next slide, please. And I should mention that spinners or textile mills need to do this for all suppliers and all material it's purchasing. So this slide shows how one can validate the origin of material by using various transaction documents that they receive. This process may require checking the documents from bills of lading, purchase orders, packing lists, and any government documents to confirm the what quantity of lint or yarn, where, origin and transportation routes, and when, production date, transit duration, and delivery date. This is done on all documents and to make sure that they match one another and make logical sense, and I refer to this as the dates, weights, and gates. An effective due diligence management system would include a process to receive and check these documents for all the material that the enterprise receives. And our experience indicates that all spinners do this because they want to be sure they're getting exactly what they pay for. A processor is also expected to account for all material and losses that is received, processed, and converted into product. These processes should be periodically reviewed for accuracy to reconcile inventories and identify and investigate any discrepancies. Again, my experience indicates that the vast majority of processors, spinners, or mills have internal processes to control this, just as they are trying to manage their production loss. Next slide. Under YESS, if risks are identified, an enterprise must conduct additional due diligence. For example, an enterprise should fully understand the factual circumstances, including all of the actors, points of mixing, etc., in their supply chain to be able to identify risks related to the responsible business conduct policy and assess whether or not these can be mitigated in order to continue to source from those areas and/or suppliers. They should also develop a process around identifying, assessing, and mitigating risk. This is best when documented in actionable milestones and monitoring, both to make sure that the planned activities are implemented as intended and that they're actually effective. The further up the supply chain, the more enterprises will need to rely on others, such as industry associations or sustainable initiatives, to assess and mitigate these risks. Unfortunately, this is not currently possible in the Uyghur region. Until credible and independent assessments can be conducted in the Uyghur regions, brands should assume all cotton, lint, and yarn from the region poses a high risk of involving forced labor. At some point in the future, if a credible forced labor-free source could be identified and verified, it would require transportation through a robust chain of custody to ensure that it is segregated from any other high-risk sources. Next slide, please. The YESS standard and the OECD call on companies to develop and implement a plan to prevent or mitigate future harm in their supply chains if it's discovered. This plan should detail what actions the enterprise itself will take with clear timelines for follow-up. The measures pursued should be proportionate to the severity of the harm. Since it's not currently possible to prevent or mitigate harm in the Uyghur region, spinners and mills need to cease or avoid sourcing from those high-risk regions and suppliers. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned earlier, the YESS cotton standard and associated workbook focus on spinning mills and their due diligence of cotton lint they purchase and process. The standard sets out due diligence management system expectations, and the workbook is the assessment tool and report template. Our goals are to create a cotton yarn standard and workbook for application at the textile mills. And also to create trainings, guidance documents, and other tools to assist spinners and textile mills enhance existing system and processes to meet the YESS due diligence expectation. My experience working in the minerals industry for the past 12 years has found that they are capable of achieving these goals as long as we help them and provide a very consistent message and request to do so. So with that, I will hand this back over to Patricia. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Liz. And we are receiving some questions about difficulty in audio. I was able to hear Liz the entire time, so apologies if some of the audio is not working for everyone. As mentioned, we are recording this webinar, so ideally the recording will be okay, and you'll be able to hear the entire webinar afterwards through the recording. In regards to the next steps for Responsible Sourcing Network and the YESS initiative, we have been reaching out to brands, retailers, as well as business associations about how to best utilize all this work that Liz and I did and received a lot of comments from all in developing the standard and the workbook, because we feel it really is a great solution and aligned with the requested due diligence that's happening right now for regulation and the legislation regarding cotton inputs, cotton products coming from the Uyghur region. And what we're looking at, as Liz said, is we designed the YESS standard to apply to spinning mills, but we see the need to also apply it to textile mills. And so we're looking to raise funds right now to make that adaptation, that modification, so that we can apply it to textile mills. And we're also talking to various industry initiatives such as the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, the Social Labor Convergence Program, and Better Cotton Initiative to see how we could collaborate and integrate the YESS standard and this due diligence approach into existing efforts. Next slide, please. And so what we're looking for from all of you to make this a reality, because even though the standard and workbook exist, they are not it's not yet being rolled out globally, because the idea is that a spinner or a textile mill would go through an annual audit to demonstrate that it is implementing its own due diligence program, that it has its own policies, procedures, management systems. As YESS laid out, these spinners, through the research that Liz and I did, we know they're already collecting this data, but they haven't had to demonstrate it, and they haven't had to show if or where they're sourcing from, and if they're sourcing from a high-risk region, how are they able to demonstrate that it's not contributing to forced labor? So it's all there. We just need to be able to implement it now. And so we're looking for financial support from the industry, because it's not just that one brand would implement this. We're looking to implement this similar to how SLCP has gone about creating a single verification of information. We want to be able to do that annually for spinning mills. And since we want to have it be a system that everyone could use, we need some support getting it off the ground. Therefore, we're looking for financial support to be able to modify and apply the YESS standard to textile mills. We're in need of $222,000. As a brand, you could nominate a textile mill to go through the feasibility test once it's created, and work with us to determine the most appropriate way to integrate YESS with other industry standards. There were a number of us that just worked together, for example, offering additional questions to the social labor convergence data tool. All right, with that, I will turn it back to my colleague, Jamie, and start to answer some of the many questions that have been coming in.
Yeah, so we're going to get started on our Q&A. Just as a reminder, because I've gotten a couple questions about it, we will be sending out the recording. We'll also be sending out the slide deck. So if there's something you missed or something you want to go back to, you are more than welcome to check that out. Like I said at the beginning, for those of you who didn't hear it, go ahead. On the right side of your screen should be a tab called questions. You can go ahead and type in any questions you have for the speakers now. We will also be creating an FAQ on the Responsible Sourcing Network website. And so if your question didn't get answered, you can go ahead and check that out once we've posted it. We'll send out a link once we have. And then on the next slide, please. Here's the contact information for all of our speakers today. So if there's something you'd like to reach out to an individual about, you can go ahead and take down their information. We'll keep this up while we're doing the question and answer. So whoever wants to get started, I believe there was a question Liz wanted to answer. If you wanna start us off, Liz.
Sure. There was a question whether or not the YESS standard was similar to the conflict-free smelter, or it's now called the Responsible Minerals Initiative. And indeed, we did use the RMAP, the Responsible Minerals Assurance Program standard, which is aligned with OECD due diligence guidance as a model for the YESS standard. And I will just share that I'm very involved with the Minerals Initiative, currently supporting the smelters and refiners by providing them advice and guidance documents so that they can achieve the goals expected. And I'm thoroughly impressed at how that initiative has been scaled, not only across the original 3 T's, G's, tin, tantalum, tungsten, and gold, but it's now being embraced by the London Metals Exchange and will be voluntarily, but basically kind of a right to operate for additional minerals such as aluminum, zinc, nickel. And so this is achievable. It is scalable, even in complex commodity supply chains.
Louise, I saw that there were a number of questions about remediation, and I thought maybe you could talk to that, what's considered appropriate remedial action. And along those lines, there's also the question somebody brought up, that they heard that they should not require Uyghurs to be sent back to the region, as this could put them at risk. So I was wondering if you could answer those two questions together.
Yes, thank you. Several people have asked the question, how can conditions be made better for Uyghurs, and what's worse or better? I work for Uyghur organizations. I'm in constant contact with many of the 70 Uyghur organizations that have endorsed the call to action. It is theoretically possible that a factory in China, not in the Uyghur region, but in cities along the East Coast, might, in order to comply with international brands' demands, then terminate the hiring of these Uyghurs for sale that they may have ordered in batches. It's truly dehumanizing the way the labor recruitment happens here, people forced to leave home and go to these factories. It is possible that they would suffer. The answer of the Uyghur diaspora is, our people are being crushed. We have hundreds upon hundreds of intellectuals, the teachers at the universities, the doctors, the nurses, the entrepreneurs, the philanthropists. They have been hounded into detention camps on the basis of their ethno-religious identity, fitting the definition of concentration camps, rounding people up and forcing them into high security facilities. Uyghurs are already at risk under the current Chinese government since 2016. So we now are 4 years into a policy of total ethno-religious persecution. Uyghurs say, who have endorsed this call to action, because they assess the risk of doing nothing as being the acquiescence, complicity, and profiting from a government plan, a top-down government plan to completely crush Uyghur culture, Uyghur identity, and the Uyghurs themselves. Deaths in custody are unknown because of the extreme level of security and secrecy. So the theoretical risk that a company has perhaps forced a Uyghur to lose a factory job that they might have been in voluntarily is far outweighed by the government plan to ensure that 12 million or more Uyghurs cease to exist as a people, cease to be able to speak their own language, cease to be able to worship according to their own religious beliefs. And so the idea of keeping existing business as usual arrangements is completely unacceptable to Uyghurs who are speaking out and crying for the world to respond in some way, so that the Chinese government indeed does know that this is the world does not accept business as usual in the 21st century. And the idea of being able to promote ethical production standards in the Uyghur region is for the very same reason a dream. This is a government that has ignored a UN, US government, global calls, investigative reporting, media reporting, month after month, day after day, and has continued its what we call genocidal policies to crush and in fact eliminate a people as a people. And therefore this is not a normal situation with a lot of corruption and shortcuts and violations happening that should be addressed by the government. The government is committing these abuses by forcing Uyghurs both into camps and into forced labor situations where they're locked up, unable to call their families, unable to see their families, unable to get married. You know, there are basically no Uyghur babies being born. So the enormity, the evil of this system is so large that we have to think beyond a standard presumption that, well, maybe these 50 workers may be harmed. They're all on a path to destruction in any event. And the important thing here is that companies and governments have an obligation to remove complicity and, of course, at the same time, conduct a multilateral, multi-government, multi-sector, private sector and government alike, and the international organizations responsible for decent work and decent and responsible business need to work together to try to reverse these policies on the part of the Chinese state.
Great, thanks, Louisa. I know there's a lot of questions. So I'll just answer one of them, which is about verification of spinners and textile mills. The way we see it that we could get started on that would be, as I said, one, modify the standard for textile mills. So you could see if those textile mills are using any cotton yarn from the Uyghur region, right? Or actually verify that they're not using any cotton yarn from the Uyghur region. And we see that happening most likely starting outside of China. So in Vietnam, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, places that would be easy enough to do those verifications. I think doing that type of verification within China, whether that be in eastern or southern China outside of the Uyghur region, would be difficult. I think it's something to look toward. However, I think the auditing of those facilities of mills and spinners, knowing that there is so much involvement by the Chinese government in overseeing those facilities, we're not sure if accurate information could be achieved. And I think, Liz, I don't know if you're going to have more comment on that, but I think looking outside of China would be the way to get this started. Also, there was a question about if YESS would only be focused on cotton originating in the Uyghur region. As Liz mentioned, we're looking at we see 9 countries as having high risk, which does include Turkmenistan, and knowing that there's a WRO on Turkmen cotton and cotton product, that it could be applied to that situation as well. I think to get it off the ground, we could have a narrower focus, but eventually we'd want to include oversight for all 9 of those countries. I know we're coming up to the top of the hour, so Jamie, I'm just going to take over here and see if Liz has comment. Maybe you could do your last comments as well as see if there's any questions you could speak to that have come in.
Sure, and just to build off of what you said, YESS was intended to address all of the high-risk countries of origin. It is daunting, but there are ways to use trade flow to identify the countries with highest risk of receiving the cotton and the yarn. So I think it's very important to use logic and a risk-based approach, and it is paramount that we get started. We are not going to clean up the cotton supply chain overnight, and possibly not in my career, but it is very important that we get started, and I firmly believe that the YESS approach and the YESS standard applied to both spinning mills and textile mills is the approach to do that.
And Louisa, do you have any final comments?
I wanted to address the remediation question very briefly. Of course, companies should ask their suppliers to compensate workers who have been working under conditions that violate ILO standards. At the same time, if that is not possible, given, as we said, top-level government policies completely crushing freedom of speech and limiting the ability of outsiders to in any way contact Uyghurs or find out what their conditions were, there is always the possibility of supporting those people outside China who've been affected by this horrific, grave crisis affecting 12 million people by supporting humanitarian and refugee relief, people who have been separated from their families. And we certainly support concerned parties, whether private sector or non-governmental, to support Uyghur groups in exile. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Louisa. And I'll just make a comment too in regards to cotton and YESS. As Liz said, it's modeled after the conflict-free sourcing initiative of ensuring that smelters are not using conflict minerals from the Democratic Republic of Congo, but being able to demonstrate that if they are sourced conflict-free, then it would be okay to source from there. So that's why we're talking to BCI and others that even if you are sourcing from a high-risk region, you'd like to be able to source product that you know has been verified for not having forced labor in it. I'm part of a task force, an expert task force right now for a Better Cotton Initiative focused on forced labor and decent work, and to be able to have their system be more robust and credible. As we said, due diligence is not currently implementable in the Uyghur region right now, and we know such a large percentage of cotton is coming from that region. And so the OECD approach is you want to prevent, you want to mitigate, and if you can't do those two things, you have to cease doing business from there. So that's what the various government legislation is asking companies to do. It's what the call to action is asking companies to do, and YESS can help the industry get there. So we do ask you for your support. Thank you so much. I'm just going to say it. Thanks for coming. We're at the top of the hour. The recording will go out within 48 hours. And please reach out to us personally. We'll put some FAQs up on our website. And if needed, we can email you directly as well. So thank you all for attending.